Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is the second of a two-part lecture on moral reasoning. In the first lecture, which I encourage you to watch before this one, I discussed the 3 steps to moral reasoning. I also discussed steps to overcoming a paradigm and challenging paradigms, and what happens when we have a paradigm shift. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about different forms of resistance and ways to overcome that resistance. So when we're talking about overcoming resistance, we have to begin to identify where the resistance comes from. And so when we're challenged in moral settings, as well as other settings, we might have various defense mechanisms that we use. So if someone challenges us on some action that we've performed before, for example, lying or having sex before marriage, we might have a psychological tool which we typically learn early on for coping with this kind of difficult situation. These are called defense mechanisms, and these defense mechanisms are typically beyond our control, and what we do is we have to come to recognize what's going on as a defense mechanism and begin to cope with the difficult situation in a way that is healthy for us. Now, we do have healthy defense mechanisms. For example, coping. Coping allows us to work through challenges to our worldview and to adjust our life in ways that maintain our integrity. So different kinds of coping might include logical analysis. So taking a class on ethics, taking a class in logic might help us to cope with challenges to our particular worldview. Trying to find some objectivity. Here, by objectivity, we might mean the advice of others. We might be asking others how they see this situation. There might be tolerance of ambiguity. So there might be some ambiguity in our own lives where we're not really sure what the correct move is, or perhaps we've done two different things that seem like they contradict each other, and that leaves us in a situation of feeling bad, and we have to learn to tolerate that kind of ambiguity. Having empathy for others might also help us to cope with challenges that are presented to us from our family or friends where they did something that we might find objectionable and challenges us to come up with ways to kind of associate with them. And then also we have to learn to suppress harmful emotional responses. Again, this can be a healthy defense mechanism where we use that emotional response and channel it into a different kind of more creative and healthy activity than a destructive activity. But of course, there might also be immature defense mechanisms, and here we're talking specifically about kinds of resistance. Using the defense mechanisms in a way that is rigid, impulsive, maladaptive, and non-analytical. It could isolate us. We could use rationalization and indecision. These are different ways that we might avoid confronting or coping with the challenge before us in a way that prevents us from growing and prevents us from living a healthier lifestyle in which we can manage to achieve some sort of flourishing. So let's just talk about the different forms of resistance. We might begin talking about ignorance. So we avoid learning about particular issues. In a situation where we're faced with a situation of euthanasia, perhaps we simply don't learn about the different forms of euthanasia. We don't learn about brain death. We avoid the situation altogether and simply remain ignorant about the possibilities here. This might be true about, say, racism, how racism might affect us. It could be particularly true about, for instance, what is typically referred to as white privilege. We might avoid learning about what that term might mean. Avoidance, here we avoid people who have different views from us. This has become such a key factor in our political society, particularly in the United States. I recently saw a study that said that in the 1950s and 1960s, people from different political parties could marry and have a long-lasting relationship. Today, most people don't believe that. They believe that if a a Democrat marries a Republican, it's simply bound for failure and catastrophe. We see this also online, and I think online presence has created even more avoidance where we begin to just stay within our own tribe and do not meet other people who have views different from us. And we see this in many kinds of radio talk show hosts, Rush Limbaugh being the most prominent one, but other kinds of shows where we just stay on one side and don't open ourselves up to other kinds of voices and visions. Some other forms of resistance, getting angry with people who disagree with us. We see this quite often in politics, certainly when we challenge our own worldviews. I was teaching a class once which was going very well, and there was some discussion about racism, and then someone was challenged for having white privilege, and the person just got so angry, and I thought the person was going to stand up and storm out of the class. He didn't do that in the end, but there was a real reaction that prevented that person from listening to anything else that was said in the class right then. We might have the same sense when we meet people who challenge other kinds of views that we might have. Cliches, responding with cliched phrases. The most popular one, which I talked about in the first lecture here, was "that's just your opinion." This is a cliched phrase that shuts off conversation. So all these forms of resistance are ways of shutting off conversation, of protecting ourselves from being challenged. And of course, one of the greatest ways that we do that is conformity, going along with a group rather than facing being rejected. So if we're in with a group of people and they begin to do something that we disagree with, we often just go along rather than challenging the group because we're afraid that we might be rejected by them. Some more forms of resistance, struggling. Here we say that we're struggling and we prolong the struggle rather than addressing the issue. And sometimes it just comes to the point that we must act. And I think we've seen that a lot in terms of the more recent women's movement challenging ideas about relationships between men and women and saying that it's time to act and we have to just stop with trying to come to some kind of internal struggle and overcoming that, but saying that we have to actually do something here. Of course, we can also allow ourselves to get distracted, and in today's media world, today's Facebook, Tumblr, Twitter, with all the information that we can have about our favorite celebrities, it's easy simply to just get distracted from what's going on in the everyday world, and we don't have to worry about it anymore because we can do something else that takes us away from this challenging situation. Some other ways of resisting that are not part of the defense mechanisms that I've just talked about, we see in everyday life. So the idea that mine is better, on this basis, we're simply rejecting the other position because we think ours is better and we don't actually look at or compare or analyze our own position. We just say, for example, capitalism is better than communism because communism has always failed. And that prevents us from looking at the different ways that capitalism might have failed. For example, that there are 1 in 6 people is starving and dies every year from starvation. We might also just simply not question our own way of thinking here. The double standard is using one set of criteria for judging cases that concern us or someone we identify with, and another set for judging other cases. So here is when we say, oh, it's okay for us to do this kind of thing, but it's not okay for them. We've seen this a lot in the last several years in terms of the way that Republicans and Democrats react to each other. So Republicans will say, oh, we're allowed to do this, but then when a Democrat does the same thing, they say, oh, they're guilty of, for example, closing down the government. And Democrats will do the same thing. So here we're just applying different rules to us from them and making an exception for ourselves. We might have also unwarranted assumptions that we take for granted and we never challenge. So these assumptions might be about race, or it might be about gender, it might be about people who are classified as millennials. We often see many unwarranted assumptions about millennials, and we don't question those assumptions. We just go with them and refuse to ask ourselves about them. We might oversimplify a case. So here is where we just reduce the case to manageable proportions and distort it, and we don't really think about how individuals might have a more complex situation that require more careful thinking. And finally, a hasty conclusion is when we embrace a judgment before really examining the case fully. And here, again, is a chance when we have to step back from our own beliefs and look at the situation more carefully. And I gave you some steps for doing that in the first lecture. Now, one of the more interesting concepts that we can examine here is the concept of doublethink, which is the term used by George Orwell in his book 1984, and he's written an essay on this. The idea is that we hold two contradictory views at the same time and hold both of them to be true. So, for example, in America, it's often common to say that no one can judge another's morals, and yet we also say that the 9/11 terrorists were wrong. These are contradictory views. If we can't judge another person's morals, then we can't really say that the terrorists of 9/11 were wrong. And if we believe that the 9/11 terrorists were wrong, we can't say that no one can judge another morals. And so we have this ability, very interesting ability to hold two contradictory positions in our head and not recognize that they contradict each other. Again, this is a chance for us to step back from our everyday opinions, write out what we really believe and experience, and then step back from that and analyze it the way I suggested in the first lecture. Doublethink is a very prominent problem in our current society, and we see this in all kinds of different moral debates, and I encourage you to ask yourself about your own sort of doublethink. So in these two lectures, I've gone over moral reasoning and some steps to get to clearer moral reasoning on a variety of issues, also ways of challenging our own paradigms. What we have here in this lecture is a list of different resistances that we might have, which prevent us from moving forward, from growing and flourishing, as well as other forms of thinking that might prevent us from engaging in dialogue. And the conclusion of this two-part lecture is that if we really want to engage in moral reasoning, we have to be willing to question our own beliefs and also be open to others so that we can understand their beliefs before coming to conclusions about a particular moral or a political issue.